Благодаря много, господин Паси, скъпи Мони, за тази много приятна, много дружеска презентация. If you allow me, I will make my presentation in English. First and foremost, I would like to thank the President of the Atlantic Club of Bulgaria, my dear friend Solomon Pasi. I'm proud also to be one of the founders of this Atlantic Club, and it gives me a double pleasure to be here with you in my double capacity as Director General of UNESCO, and also I think you still consider me a member of the Atlantic Club. You have not excluded me from the club. And also to be...
You will pay higher membership fee.
UNESCO doesn't have a lot of money, but that's another story. We can negotiate. But I'm really extremely honored to be here among President Alexander Kwasniewski, the former president of Poland, a very, I would say, emblematic figure for all of East Europe, of our transition towards and joining us, European Union and NATO, and of course, Bill Richardson, the former ambassador of the United States to the United Nations. I mentioned maybe one of your, Mr. Richardson, important from my point of view positions also within the United Nations system, but I know that you have a long and very distinguished career as also a diplomat and as politicians, and Moni Pasi mentioned this extensively. So, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, excellencies, members of Parliament, first and foremost, I believe that every generation faces challenges it must overcome. Today, I believe one of these is countering violent extremism. Rising to this challenge requires mobilization across the board. It calls for new forms of action, and it will demand time and will. I come from Paris. UNESCO is based in Paris, and we have seen on the 13th November the brutal nature of this threat. 130 men and women killed, 352 wounded, a state of emergency, a world shocked. These barbarous acts are part of a wider trend featuring the unprecedented rise of violent extremism. 215 opened with terrorist attacks in Paris on 7th, 9th January. It continued with the attacks against the Bardo Museum in Tunisia on 18th March. It included attacks in Beirut on 12th November, and unfortunately, the list is long. The big picture includes the conflicts in Syria and Iraq, instability in the region and beyond. These, of course, are devastating humanitarian tragedies. As Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi, who is with us during this conference, maybe he's here in the hall, dear Mr. Brahimi, welcome here. I'm quoting you, who was the former joint special representative of the United Nations and the League of Arab States, and of course among his other very distinguished also shows of his career, who were also saying that the devastating humanitarian tragedies are also conflicts where culture is on the front line. And we have seen also in these pictures on the 30th of August, the Temple of Bel was destroyed. The Umayyad Mosque in Aleppo has become a battlefield. On 4th of October, the Arch of Triumph in Palmyra was blown up. In Iraq, 2 of 4 World Heritage sites, Hatra and Ashur, and at least 9 other sites have been destroyed. In Syria, all 6 World Heritage sites have been damaged by fighting, 4 severely affected, including the old cities of Aleppo and Damascus. And across the region, illegal excavations have industrial scale, financing further violent extremism. We know, and one should say, that culture has always been the victim of war. But what we see today is quite new. We see the deployment of a strategy of deliberate destruction, of cultural cleansing, featuring systematic attacks against cultural heritage and diversity. Cultural cleansing is a war crime that involves massive violations of human rights and the persecution of people on ethnic and religious grounds. Muslims, Yazidis, Shabaks, Assyrians, Christians, all are attacked. It seeks to destroy identities, it tears the fabric of societies, it weakens sources of belonging. It attacks diversity to impose an exclusive vision of society. All voices of peace are targets. Just think of the barbaric killing of the scholar and humanist, the great friend of UNESCO, Dr. Khaled al-Assad, in Palmyra. And I was very privileged to visit Palmyra before the conflict in 2011 and to know personally Dr. Khaled al-Assad, who accompanied me to admire the beauty of this extraordinary World Heritage Site. And he wanted to stay there. He wanted to protect it because he couldn't imagine his life without Palmyra. And we know that the history of this region is one of millennial dialogue across cultural and religious lines. It is precisely this history violent extremists are attacking because this history delegitimizes them. In 2012, we saw the same violence in Mali. Violent extremism is fueled by a global propaganda campaign on the internet, targeting young people to radicalize and create a sense of impunity for appalling acts. Between 50 and 70,000 Twitter accounts support Daesh today. The group has issued more than 700 videos only since 2014. And all these are high-quality, multilingual, and carefully targeted, referencing popular films, video games, and music. And unfortunately, this is increasingly effective. Today, some 25,000 foreign terrorist fighters from over 100 states are active in Syria and Iraq, as well as Afghanistan, Libya, and Yemen. Violent extremism is the red thread tying this picture together. There is no single cause for its rise, nor is there a single trajectory leading someone to extremist violence. But what we do know is that hard power is not enough to counter a threat fueled by an exclusive vision of the world, based on false interpretations of fate, on hatred, ignorance, and intolerance. We need soft power as well. We need the message of the UNESCO Constitution written 70 years ago. I believe we face a global battle for hearts and minds of young people today. And this must start, as I said, with young hearts and minds. Let me highlight here last week's historic United Nations Security Council resolution on youth, peace, and security, underlying the role of young women and men in countering violent extremism. Violent extremists promote fear and division. We must respond with skills for critical thinking, opportunities for civic engagement, competencies for intercultural dialogue. Violent extremists preach exclusion and hatred. We must teach human rights, tolerance, and solidarity, because I do believe no one is born a violent extremist. Violent extremists are made, they are fueled. Young people today in these circumstances are learning to hate. We must teach them peace. I see this as the new front line today, in conflict situations, in refugee camps, in societies across the world. Education is the way to disarm processes that can lead to violent extremism, by undermining prejudice, by fighting indifference and ignorance. And this is what inspires UNESCO's action today. On 6 November, we held the first ever high-level conference on education to prevent and counter violent extremism with Mr. Anthony Blinken, United States Deputy Secretary of State, and more than 80 education ministers from across the world. Member states at UNESCO recently agreed on a resolution on UNESCO's role in promoting education as a tool to prevent violent extremism. At the invitation of the President of the United States, I spoke at the Leaders' Summit on Countering ISIL and Violent Extremism in September in New York. And you can see, UNESCO is acting across the board to advance global citizenship education, to teach the history of the Holocaust and other genocides, to fight discrimination today and prevent new violence. The same goals underpins UNESCO's forthcoming Teacher's Guide on Violent Extremism. In Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, UNESCO is investing in education for young internally displaced persons and refugees. The world simply cannot afford to lose a generation in this region to violence and extremism. The same spirit guides the UNESCO NetMet Youth Project to support young women and men in 10 countries across the Mediterranean. The internet, ladies and gentlemen, is another front in this struggle. We must respond to the propaganda of violent extremism, because violent extremists say humanity is not a single community, and we must respond. They say diversity is dangerous, tolerance unacceptable. We must respond by showing dialogue between cultures as the driving force of all history. This is why I went to the University of Baghdad last March to launch a social media campaign, Unite for Heritage, to counter hate propaganda, to strengthen the narrative of shared values and shared heritage. Last June, UNESCO held a groundbreaking conference on youth and the internet, fighting radicalization and extremism. And I thank particularly the government of Bulgaria for its support. The same goals underpin UNESCO's new initiative, empowering youth to build peace online, to counter youth radicalization. And of course, we must act also to defend humanity's cultural heritage, because I deeply believe this is not just about stones, bricks, and buildings. This is about human beings. It is about human dignity and identity. This is about culture as a force of resilience. And we have strong legal foundations to build on. This includes the 1970 Convention against the illicit trafficking of cultural property. This last February, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2199 broke new ground, banning cultural trade from Iraq and Syria under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Tasked by the Security Council, UNESCO is supporting governments to strengthen legislation, build capacities, deepen information sharing. UNESCO is working in very close cooperation in a coalition of partners like Interpol, United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, the World Customs Organization, and many, many others. We are bolstering coordination among law enforcement agencies, experts, museums, and auction houses, reinforcing legal frameworks and building capacity. And I believe our efforts are bearing fruit. Governments are adjusting and strengthening legislation, capacity building and training have started, and I'm determined to continue. This includes fighting impunity for war crimes. This is why UNESCO works so closely with the International Criminal Court. I welcome the transfer of the first suspect to the International Criminal Court in the Mali investigation for the war crime of the intentional destruction of monuments and buildings dedicating to religion. Of course, I mean what happened in Timbuktu, in Gao, in Kidal, where extremists destroyed mausoleums, burned manuscripts. And we must continue. Because, ladies and gentlemen, speaking about Mali, in 2013, I visited Timbuktu at the invitation to accompany him of President François Hollande, and I promised, in front of one of the destroyed mausoleums, I promised the local community to rebuild the mausoleums destroyed by extremists. Last July, I returned to Timbuktu with Her Excellency Ramandei Ramatoulaye, who is coming with us, the Minister of Culture. She will join us later this afternoon, Minister of Culture of Mali, to celebrate the reconstruction of all the 14 mausoleums. And I think it was a very moving moment, because it was so important for the people of Mali. But it goes beyond the history of Mali. It is important for the history and the future of the Islamic world. It is important for all the humanity, because the burnt manuscripts contain the wisdom of millennium of Arab philosophy, medicine, teachings, and also the transfer of the old Greek knowledge philosophers to the Western world. And I believe we did all this with the government, with the local communities, because we were determined to restore the glorious past, but also to counter violent extremism. This is how I believe we must act together at every level to overcome this challenge through education, through culture, through freedom of expression, through action on the basis of our conviction that humanity is a single community, sharing values, a past, present, and a future. And once again, I would like to thank the Atlantic Club, our partner in this important conference, because I do believe, being of course a Bulgarian, that people in Bulgaria are very sensitive to this history. People of Bulgaria have a deep sense of tolerance, of respect for multiculturalism and for diversity. And I'm sure that they're not only following, but they're suffering with the people of Syria, of Iraq, of Mali, and else, where they see the surge of this violent extremism. Thank you.
Thank you, Director General. Thank you very much for your so touching expose, and of course for the kind words which you mentioned about our joint organization. Sometimes we see that the Bulgarians have problems to govern our own country. But obviously the Bulgarians do not have problems to govern UNESCO and entities of this sort. So I very much hope that the election of Mrs. Bokova as Director General of UNESCO will pave the way for many more elections of this sort of Bulgarians on key international positions. And I know that everybody here has in mind one very big question in that regard.